Okay, picture this. You are sitting right in the cockpit of the global economy. It's this massive, incredibly complex machine, just humming with the energy of literally billions of people making daily decisions. You look down at the controls, and you're staring at countless vital signs, flashing numbers, and these heavy, intimidating levers. How do you even begin to fly this thing? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we are opening up the pilot's manual to the macroeconomy. We're going to decode those dials on the dashboard and really understand the levers that dictate our everyday lives, from the prices we pay at the grocery store to the absolute security of our jobs.
Here's our flight plan for today. 1. The macroeconomic forest. 2. The circular flow machine. 3. Reading the economic dashboard. 4. Writing the business cycle. And finally, 5. Steering the economy.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Part 1, the macroeconomic forest.
To really wrap our heads around this, we've got to completely shift our perspective from our individual day-to-day lives to the massive aggregate whole. Think of it this way. If microeconomics is the study of the individual trees, macroeconomics is the study of the entire forest. In micro, we're zooming in on a single household, a specific business, or maybe just the price of one commodity, like coffee or steel. We're looking at how that specific market clears. But in macro, we zoom all the way out. We aren't looking at the price of your morning coffee, we are looking at the general price level, the inflation across the entire system. We aren't looking at one company's profit, we're looking at the total national income. It's a whole different beast, and it requires a completely different set of analytical tools.
Moving right along to Part 2, the circular flow machine. So how does this giant aggregate system actually operate? We really need to look at the economy not as some static, boring spreadsheet, but as a living, breathing engine. Let's actually trace the endless loop of money through this machine. It all starts with step 1, households. That's you and me. We provide our labor, and in return, we get wages which we then go out and spend. That money naturally flows right into step 2, firms. These businesses take our labor and our spending, and they produce goods and services. But wait, it doesn't stop there. Step 3 brings in the government, which siphons off taxes from this flow, but then injects it right back by providing public goods. Think roads, bridges, legal systems, the stuff that keeps the market functioning. And finally, step 4 blows the loop wide open globally. The rest of the world gets involved through exports and imports. It is just this never-ending, continuous circular flow of income and spending.
Now, what's really fascinating about this setup is how entirely fragile yet mathematically elegant this balance is. For this engine to run smoothly, the money leaking out of the system, which we call withdrawals, absolutely must be perfectly balanced by injections. When we save money, when the government collects taxes, or when we buy imported goods, purchasing power basically leaks right out of our domestic loop. And if nothing replaces it, the economy contracts. Businesses build up unsold inventory, and they start laying people off. But if those savings are channeled into investments by the banks, if taxes are turned into government spending, and if our imports are offset by our exports to the rest of the world, well, the machine stays perfectly balanced.
All right, let's look at Part 3, reading the economic dashboard.
When you're sitting in that pilot seat, you need concrete numbers to tell you if the engine is humming along or failing. The biggest, absolute most prominent dial on that dashboard is GDP, or gross domestic product. It is the total money value of all final goods and services produced in a given period by a country's factors of production. Now, the critical word here is final. We only count final goods to avoid double counting. Think about it. If we counted the value of the raw wheat, and then the flour, and then the baked bread, we'd be artificially inflating the size of our economy. We literally only count that final loaf of bread sitting there on the grocery store shelf.
Because the economy is this continuous circular flow we just talked about, we can actually calculate this massive GDP number from 3 completely different angles, and, amazingly, they will all reconcile. We can measure it by production, just adding up the gross value added across every single sector. We can measure it by income, tallying up all the wages, rent, interest, and profit earned. Or we can measure it by expenditure, adding up total consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Because one person's spending is exactly equal to another person's income, all 3 of these mathematical methods ultimately lead us to the exact same total number. Pretty cool, right?
But GDP is just one dial. We also have to monitor the heat of the engine, and that is inflation. And inflation isn't just one simple number. Policymakers actually use a few different indices to see exactly where the pressure is building up. You've got the CPI, which tracks retail prices. That's the actual everyday cost of living for consumers like us. Then there's the WPI, or PPI, which looks a bit higher up the supply chain at the cost of production in wholesale markets. And finally, the GDP deflator, which is the ultimate, comprehensive, economy-wide measure. Sometimes pressure starts building up in the wholesale index way before it ever trickles down to us consumers, which gives policymakers a crucial early warning signal.
Then we get to the most, well, human dial on the dashboard, unemployment. So the crucial point here is that unemployment isn't just some abstract data point on a chart. It literally represents human dignity, living standards, and the baseline structural health of our society. In conventional macro theory, some models sort of assume that growth will just automatically fix unemployment. But as we know, reality is far messier than that. Actually, we can put a hard number on exactly how punishing unemployment is to an economy using something called Okun's Law. Get this, for every 1% that the unemployment rate rises above its natural baseline, the economy loses about 2% of its potential GDP. That is a massive, tangible loss of wealth and output. It really just highlights how deeply intertwined the human element of labor is with the hard, cold mathematics of economic growth.
Let's move to part 4 and see how all this builds, riding the business cycle.
Out in the real world, the economy never flies in a perfectly straight line, does it? It moves through periods of turbulence that we call the business cycle. Growth naturally undulates around an average trend line, so we experience periods of expansion where spending is high and jobs are super plentiful. But eventually we hit a peak, capacity gets totally maxed out and inflation heats up. That gives way to a contraction or a recession, where aggregate demand falls, output drops, and unemployment spikes, eventually hitting a rock bottom known as a trough, right before the whole cycle begins all over again. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate headache for anyone trying to manage this cycle, the Phillips curve. Discovered by looking at nearly a century of data, the original Phillips curve showed a really strict inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. Meaning, in the short term, you usually just cannot have both low inflation and low unemployment. If you try to squeeze unemployment down by stimulating the economy, wages go up, business costs go up, and boom, you get higher inflation. It's a deeply painful, inherent trade-off.
Well, at least it was a predictable trade-off right up until the 1970s. That's when massive global oil shocks literally broke the original Phillips curve, introducing the world to an absolute nightmare scenario called stagflation. This is the dreaded worst of both worlds combination of high inflation and stagnating economic output with high unemployment. How on earth does this happen? Well, when people start to expect high inflation, those inflationary expectations get completely baked into wage negotiations and contracts. Suddenly, the entire curve shifts. You suffer from skyrocketing prices, but without any of the benefits of a booming job market.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, Steering the Economy.
So with the threat of recessions and inflation constantly looming, how do the folks in charge actually steer this massive machine? Well, it all depends on the time frame, and this is highlighted by two competing yet eventually synthesized viewpoints. The Keynesian view, which was born right out of the Great Depression, argues that in the short term, wages and prices are sticky. They just don't adjust fast enough to stop a recession. Because of that, the economy is demand-driven, and active government intervention, like stimulus spending, is absolutely necessary to smooth out the peaks and troughs of the business cycle. But then you have the classical view. This argues that over the long term, wages and prices are completely flexible. The market clears itself and the economy becomes supply-driven. So what we essentially do today is use Keynesian tactics to stabilize things in the short term while relying on classical forces to find our true equilibrium in the long run.
But listen, if we want real, lasting economic growth that spans decades, just tweaking short-term demand isn't going to cut it. We have to fundamentally shift the long-term aggregate supply curve. And there are exactly 4 specific drivers that actually make this happen. Capital accumulation, which means heavy investment in infrastructure and machinery. Demography, meaning a healthy, growing workforce. Technology adoption, and pure, unadulterated innovation. These are the real engines of true long-term prosperity. You can't just print your way to these 4 things. They require deep, structural development over time. Which leaves us with the pretty provocative question to chew on. As we sit here looking at all these powerful levers of government spending, taxation, and monetary policy, can we ever truly tame the business cycle? Or, by constantly intervening, are we just treating the short-term symptoms while totally ignoring the deeper, long-term health of the economic machine? It is the ultimate debate in public policy. But hey, now you have the pilot's manual to understand exactly what's at stake. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the dials on the dashboard.